This is the Moonlight Graham Show, a freewheeling conversation with the role players, the underdogs, and guys with flat-out great stories in sports.
Hello and welcome back to the Moonlight Graham Show, where we celebrate the role players, the underdogs, and you know it, the great stories in sports. And coming off of last week where we talked about vanity license plates in the state of Iowa, it sounds like, from the feedback that I got, a lot of people are on the same page as I am when it comes to vanity license plates. So I was glad we did a podcast episode. But if you remember from last week, one of our main categories of vanity license plates was golfing license plates. And we've got one of the great golf events of the year, every 2 years, doesn't come around every year, happening this weekend, the Ryder Cup. And of course, there's a major Iowa flavor to the Ryder Cup this year with Zach Johnson, probably, without a doubt, actually, the greatest golfer ever to come out of the state of Iowa, is the captain of the Ryder Cup team. So, of course, we got to do a podcast about Zach Johnson. I mean, hopefully one day we will get Zach Johnson here on the podcast. Oftentimes, I'll hear people say, who are the guests you still want to have on? And Zach Johnson is on that short list of people that we have not had on yet. So I'd love to have Zach Johnson on the pod. But I wanted to use this time to talk about, kind of the unique flavor that Iowa golf, even though Iowa is nowhere near a golf state, it's actually, looking into the history of Iowa golf, it's pretty bad, right? There's not many famous golfers, successful golfers really ever to come out of Iowa, but two of our most successful golfers ever cap in both the Ryder Cup team this year and also the Walker Cup team. So the Walker Cup, which is the United States versus Great Britain and Ireland, so it's not all of Europe like the Ryder Cup is, but the Walker Cup is the U.S. versus Great Britain and Ireland. They were captained, that U.S. team, which won, it beat Great Britain and Ireland earlier this year, was captained by Mike McCoy. So Mike McCoy, Des Moines insurance guy, just like myself, and he was the captain of the Walker Cup team. So I just found it amazing. I thought we needed to talk a little bit more about it here on the pod, that Mike McCoy was not only the captain of the Walker Cup team, an Iowan, lives in Iowa, and Zach Johnson, another Iowan, is the captain of the Ryder Cup team this year. Like, what are the odds of that for a state as small as Iowa? And as bad as we are historically at the game of golf, like we haven't had many good golfers come out of here, to have Mike McCoy captain the Walker Cup team and Zach Johnson captain the Ryder Cup team. It's pretty incredible. And that's what we're talking about today on the pod. And as always, folks, make sure, you're subscribing to the Moonlight Graham Show. You're leaving us a 5-star review. We love hearing feedback from you guys. Really do appreciate all that you do. Listen to the pod. Enjoy today's episode and cheer on the Americans this weekend at the Ryder Cup. Moonlighters, are you or someone you know moving down to Kansas City? Well, if you are, the one realtor that we trust and yet you need to be calling is the great Brian Sandvig. As you well know, Brian Sandvig is our producer here on the podcast, and there is not a better residential real estate advisor down in the Kansas City marketplace than Brian Sandvig. Call Brian Sandvig, shoot him a text. Hey, DM us on social media. We'll get you connected with Brian if you can't find him on all the socials, but he is there and he is active, and he is your Kansas City realtor, so give him a call. So as I was saying earlier, Zach Johnson captaining the Ryder Cup team. Zach, he's a famous Iowan. Many people know his story. So as I was, doing my Zach Johnson research, and I like I said, I'd love to have him on the podcast. If you all have contacts to Zach Johnson, please send him my way, because I want to get this guy on the podcast. He's frankly one of the top 10 Iowa athletes of all time. And looking at the Zach Johnson story, it's pretty remarkable. He grew up, was born in Iowa City, grew up in the Cedar Rapids area. He went to Iowa City Regis, or actually Cedar Rapids Regis High School. So this is a now defunct Catholic high school. And the interesting thing about Cedar Rapids Regis was Kurt Warner also went there. So two of the greatest athletes ever to come out of the state of Iowa, Zach Johnson, Kurt Warner, people know them on the national stage, on the world stage, and they both went to this tiny little Catholic high school in Cedar Rapids Regis, that no longer exists, which I find is pretty interesting. So Zach Johnson, high school golfer, led his high school team to state championship, pretty decorated high school golfer. I'm not sure how much competition you're seeing in the state of Iowa in high school golf, but he was a really good high school golfer. But what's interesting is he didn't go to Iowa or Iowa State, which you would assume would be better golf programs. I don't totally know about what the early 90s golf scene was like as far as collegiate golf here in the state of Iowa, but he went to Drake. So traditionally not as good of a golf program as Iowa or Iowa State. At Drake, they went to 3 regionals at Drake, so they had a pretty good team while he was there, but he was never even the number 1 player on the team. At least according to my research, he was the number 2 guy at Drake. So how good was that number 1 player at Drake to beat out Zach Johnson on that team, which is pretty remarkable. So Zach Johnson, he turns pro in 1998. And as we've talked about here on the podcast many a times, especially with Sam Murrett, so many really, really good college golfers, they turn pro, they think they're going to be the next Bryson DeChambeau, and when it comes down to it, they've got no chance. It's so hard to make it because the guys on the PGA Tour, there's only basically 150 spots on the PGA Tour, and most of those guys, only 15 to 20 of those spots are turning over year in and year out. So the tour's got room for 15 to 20 more guys, and you got to beat somebody out that's already on tour, which is really, really hard to do. And so more often than not, what happens is you turn pro, you end up having to play in the minor leagues, which now, is the Korn Ferry Tour. But before that, it was like the Buy.com Tour, the Hooters Tour, lots of different names through the years. So you go to these minor league tours, and oftentimes the competition at those minor league tours is guys that were collegiate All-Americans 5 years ago that are right on the brink of making the PGA Tour. And so if you're a 22-year-old kid coming out and you've got to beat all these guys that were in your shoes 5 years ago, but have spent the last 5 years improving their game, playing professional golf, playing competitive golf, it's a really tough task. And, we've talked about it with Nate McCoy. We've talked about it with Sam Murrett. The margins are so very, very thin. And even if you're an exceptionally talented golfer, man, so many of those guys, they wash out after a year or two because they just can't handle the grind and essentially being broke playing in minor league golf for a couple of years. But Zach Johnson, he actually started on the Prairie Fire Tour, which is a tour that I'm not even sure it exists or not, but a lot of those Waterloo Open type events are on tours like the Prairie Fire Tour. So right away, he won twice on that Prairie Fire Tour in 1998. He won again on that tour in 1999. He started playing in those, Buy.com and Hooters events at that point. He actually won 3 times on the minor league tours in 2001. He was the player of the year in 2003. And so when you look at kind of his professional wins, to me it looks like, and I'm sure there was, a lot of grind and a lot of dark days for Zach in his early years, but it looks to me like once he turned pro, even though he was in the minor leagues of golf, he was winning right away. So he had good momentum around him. And by 2003, he's the top player on, at that time, it was the Buy.com Tour, but like I said, we've seen it and is now the Korn Ferry Tour now. So he won 3 times on that tour in 2001, was the player of the year and the top money winner in 2003. And then he won his first PGA event in 2004. So after he was the player of the year on that Buy.com Tour in 2003, he moved on. It was an automatic promotion to the PGA Tour that next year. And right away, he won on the PGA Tour, which, of course, locks in that tour card for 2 more years. And if you can win on tour, you can really start to settle in as a professional golfer and buy yourself some more time. And it's really incredible if you look at his career now. So that was, he won his first PGA event in 2004. That was almost 20 years ago now. Throughout the course of Zach's career, he's won a total of 26 times in professional golf. 12 of those have been on the PGA Tour. He's also won twice on the European Tour. He's a 2-time major winner. So he won the 2007 Masters, the 2015 British Open. At one point, he was up to number 6 in the world. It's pretty incredible. And even on top of that, all the success, all the wins that he's had, you look back on his Ryder Cups. I mean, not just is this guy a great Iowa golfer, he's going to be a Hall of Famer. He's going to be in the Hall of Fame. He's played in 5 Ryder Cups in 2006, 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016. I mean, this guy's been a staple for the United States for essentially a decade and a half On the Ryder Cup team, he also played in the President's Cup in 07, 09, 2013, 2015. So like Zach Johnson was right in the mix with all the best golfers in the world for really like a 15-year span, which is just remarkable when you think about where he came from. Tiny little school in Cedar Rapids, Drake University, minor league golf. Like he was not Tiger Woods coming out, yet he is going to be a golf Hall of Famer. When you compare that to like a Ricky Fowler, right? So Ricky Fowler, on the other hand, played golf at Oklahoma State, which is, one of the top 3 or 4 best golf programs in the country. He immediately became one of the most popular guys on tour. He was like a phenom at 22, 23 years old on tour. He was instantly popular. Like Ricky Fowler, I think he's only won 5 times on the PGA Tour. Zach Johnson's won 12. Ricky Fowler's never won a major. And it's just, when you think about Zach in comparison to some of the guys like a Ricky Fowler, who's really well known, you're like, man, Zach, we might be underrating him. Oftentimes as Iowans, you're thinking we're putting up, some of our celebrities up on a pedestal a little bit. Frankly, Zach Johnson might be a little bit underrated. And it's so cool to see him as the captain now of the Ryder Cup team and watch, how he is going to lead that team. I've always thought that the captain of the Ryder Cup is such an interesting coaching position because, of course, golf is not a team game. And even though a lot of these guys played college golf, it's just a different makeup. But all of a sudden, the Ryder Cup, there's team formats, there's 2-ball formats, there's 4-ball formats, there's an individual format to it. You got all these guys that are competitors. A lot of them like each other, don't like each other. So there's an element of the locker room that you got to figure out. And you've got to build this team while everybody's on tour for basically the course of a year. And I've always thought the amount of strategy and the amount of thought that would go into that would be really interesting for just, basically a 3-day event. So what an interesting job that Zach Johnson has this weekend for the Americans in the Ryder Cup. The U.S. has not won on European soil since 1993. I think I saw that, 1993. So it'd be incredible if Zach was able to bring a victory home for America this weekend. I think a lot of people are going to be watching this. I've got the Ryder Cup. It's in my top 7 sporting events. So I was listing out my favorite sporting events, and I think number 1 is my first weekend of March Madness. That Thursday, Friday of March Madness is unbelievable. Opening day of baseball is probably number 2 for me. The Masters might be number 3. The World Series, when you got, a great World Series deciding game, I think World Series is number 4. Number 5 for me is the NBA Finals. Number 6, this might sound crazy, but the Iowa State football game, at least when you're in the state of Iowa, is an awesome event every year. I hope they never get rid of it because it's so much fun. And I think my next one would be the Ryder Cup. The Ryder Cup, it's such a cool golf format. And when you get that singles on Sunday and you're seeing all these guys out on the course at the same time and the momentum and the fanfare, it's really, really fun. I think the biggest downside is when it's over in Europe, people are teeing off at 1 a.m. and I'm just not at the point where I can stay up for that. So I won't be able to watch as much of it, but I really, really love this weekend. So that's the Zach Johnson part. But the other underdog here, so of course, Zach Johnson, underdog, we want him on the podcast. The other underdog, and maybe a completely different type of story, is Mike McCoy captaining the Walker Cup. So Mike McCoy, insurance executive out of Des Moines, who, if you follow golf or if you're from Iowa, you've seen his name over and over again for really the course of my lifetime over the last 37 years. We've had his son, Nate McCoy, here on the podcast. Nate is an awesome dude, awesome golfer in his own right, but his dad, Mike, is really one of the most well-known amateur golfers in the United States. He has played, just a little resume on Mike McCoy. Mike McCoy has played in 66 USGA championships, 20 US AMs, 22 US mid-AMs. He's been the Iowa Golf Association Player of the Year, which pretty big deal, 11 times. He won his first Iowa Golf Association Player of the Year in 1983. He won his last one 30 years later. So the remarkable thing about Mike McCoy is not only is he a good golfer, but he's been a world-class top talent golfer for over 30 years. So to that point, Mike McCoy, at 52 years old, played on the U.S. Walker Cup team. So typically the U.S. Walker Cup team is made up of like the best amateur golfers in the country. So typically that's like the best golfers from college golf, right? Most of the time it's guys that are 20 through 22 years old that are going to be turning pro in a couple of years, but have not yet, and they're still in college. That typically is what makes up the Walker Cup team. Mike McCoy played on that team when he was 52. Some of the other guys on that team in 2015, while with Mike McCoy, were Bryson DeChambeau. So Bryson DeChambeau was 21 years old, playing with a 52-year-old Mike McCoy. Bo Hostler, another tour guy, was on that team. Maverick McNeely was on that team as well. So all those guys are like well-known PGA guys now. Another guy was that Jordan Niebrugge, who I think Sam and I ran up against in one of our tournaments. So it was really like the who's who of college golf at that time. Plus, on that team, competing, not even a captain, but competing on that team was Mike McCoy. It's really, really remarkable. Mike McCoy won the U.S. Mid-Am on his 38th try when he was like 53 years old. So this guy was able to not only be a good golfer, but continue to get better even into his 50s. He won the 2022 U.S. British Amateur Open over at St. Andrews. So he's in his 50s now, and he's still almost as good as he's ever been right now. And to that point, he's a 3-time winner of the Coleman Invitational Championship. If you haven't heard of the Coleman Invitational Championship, it's because you haven't been invited. That is the Seminole Golf Course Invitational every year. So Seminole is one of the most private and prestigious golf clubs in the country. It's like right up there with Augusta. So people talk about Seminole all the time. And those invitational events are like the big money type events. And if you look at the tee sheet, who plays in those events, it's a lot of PGA guys. It's a lot of world-class golfers. Mike McCoy's won that tournament 3 times. He's also won the Crump Cup, which is Pine Valley's version of the Coleman Invitational, 4 times. So how cool would it be to be Mike McCoy? I'm sure he makes a pretty good living as an insurance guy, but also be a top amateur golfer where you have access to Seminole, to Pine Valley. He's played in the Masters. He's played in the British Open. What an incredible, career that would be. And now he captained the Walker Cup team this year to a victory for the U.S. It's amazing for this all to be happening at one time. One other fun fact about Mike McCoy, he's a 3-time Fort Dodge amateur champion. So not only has he won 3 times at Pine Valley or 3 times at Seminole, he's also won 3 times in Fort Dodge. You got to, shout out. I'll have to ask Mike when he comes on the podcast, because I'll have to get Mike McCoy on the podcast too. When Mike McCoy comes on the podcast, hey, compare Augusta to the Fort Dodge Country Club. Some say they're very different. Some say they're very similar. Mike McCoy, you'd be the expert on this. You tell us. Can't wait to have him share with us that on the pod here. So as you're watching the Ryder Cup this weekend, know that the United States this year, as far as team golf, has been led by Iowans. It's really Iowa versus the world this year. And I just think if you look back on Iowa's history, there's been 2 golfers ever to win a major championship out of Iowa. You had the famous Jack Fleck beating Ben Hogan in the 1955 U.S. Open, and then you've got Zach Johnson, who's won the Masters and the British Open. Other than that, there has not been another guy, and I'll have to fact check this, that has won on the PGA Tour. Troy Merritt, of course, was born in Osage. We've had him here on the podcast now. It's debatable whether we count Troy Merritt as an Iowan or not, but outside of that, you don't have anybody else that has ever won on the PGA Tour. So how rare is it for a state like Iowa to have the Walker Cup and the Ryder Cup captain? And hopefully the Iowans can bring home, the trophies for both the Walker Cup, which already happened, and also the Ryder Cup this weekend. And if they do, you're welcome, America. Signed, Iowa.
It's Moonlight Graham, yeah. It's a pretty good program, broadcasting to the heartland. Sports stories for the everyman. It's Moonlight Graham, yeah. Please follow us on Instagram. You're loving us on Twitter too. You download every pod we do. It's Moonlight Graham.